Treece and Brittany Butler are our moderators, so I'll go ahead and let them take it away.
Hey folks, how are you?
You're muted. Okay.
There we go. Hey there, folks. Welcome. Hope everybody's got their holiday shopping complete. There we go. So I guess without further ado. Nope.
Wink the camera.
We're getting there.
Okay.
We have new materials and new instruments, and we're working our way through it. You took a Perfect. Okay. All right, so we have Phyllis Thompson and Theresa McGarry. And we're gonna let these folks introduce themselves to you today. So let's start with, I think you guys see Theresa on your left.
Okay.
But you're really on our right, but don't worry.
Not to be confused. Yeah, I'm Theresa. My story started in Michigan. I lived there until my early 20s. So that was my entire growing up period. I say sometimes that I come from a small town, but the truth is we weren't even in the town. I come from the middle of cornfields. My dad was not actually a farmer. He was a factory worker in the car factories, but he liked the country. So we did not even live in the town, and it was a very little town anyways. It still is. I've been back there and there's some development, but that was where I grew up. And I went to college in Michigan also. And when I was finished, I was kind of at loose ends with no clear career path. And those were the days when, if you wanted ideas for things to do, you read the newspaper. So I read the Ann Arbor News, and there was an advertisement for English teachers in Korea. Well, it just said English teachers overseas. Do you want to teach English overseas? Bachelor's degree needed. And I was like, well, I have one of those. So I applied, and then the recruiter called me and he said it was in Korea. I said, well, I can't do that. I don't speak Korean. He said, oh, no problem with that. And so there I was on my way to Korea. And I just stumbled into a career that I just loved. I just loved teaching English as a second language. So I was, in those days, all it really took was being a native speaker, which is a prejudice problem in itself, and the bachelor's degree. So I would work one-year contracts. I worked in Korea for that year, and then I worked in Japan. The first time actually a year and a half, and then I went back for another year. It turned out that there was a branch of Temple University in Japan, so I ended up getting a master's degree in that field because I loved it so much. And then I came home and did some family things for a while and went back overseas with the Peace Corps this time. So I was in Sri Lanka from 94 to 97. There was a civil war there, you probably know, or maybe not. Sri Lanka doesn't make the news too much, but the civil war didn't end until 2009. We did complete, my batch completed our 2 years of Peace Corps service, but I think it was the batch just after us that was not able to complete because the war got too hot. And in 2009, it ended very gruesomely. And now the Peace Corps is about to bring another batch back in. I think they got held up for a couple of years because of COVID, but they may be going back in right now, for all I know. I'm helping them prepare language materials to some degree, a little bit. Wow. So that was a cool country. And then I, by that point in my life, was aware that there was a field called linguistics. And as soon as I found out what that was, I knew that that was what I had been looking for my whole life. So when I came home, I went and did a PhD at University of South Carolina in Columbia in linguistics.
Okay.
That was an experience. And then the job I found was here. And that was 2004, and I've been here ever since. And now at East Tennessee State, I teach linguistics, and I also teach composition. And I direct the program that trains teachers of English to speakers of other languages. I actually was the one who designed that program, and I'm still the director. That, I think, is where we are now.
Fabulous. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. We'll get back to a lot of that. Okay, Phyllis, who are you?
Well, I'm Phyllis Thompson, and Theresa and I met in the English department at ETSU when I arrived in 2005, and so we can circle back around there. But that's where Theresa and our story got started, was then when I moved here in 2005. But I'm originally from North Carolina, and was born in a little town called Kernersville, which is right outside of Winston-Salem, which is part of my story. We'll get to, and I come from parents that are very different. My mother is from Key West, Florida, and comes from, on one side, a history of teachers, parents who were teachers. And on the other side, on her father's side, folks from the islands. My father was from Pinola, North Carolina, which is Jonas Ridge Road in Avery County, North Carolina, Appalachia, way back in the woods in Appalachia. But he was a Navy pilot. After he was able to go to college, and from college went to Officers Candidate Training School and became a fixed wing and helicopter pilot in the Navy. Was stationed in Key West, Florida, and met my mother there. So he asks her to marry him, but before they settle on dates and a marriage, he wanted her to come to Appalachia and see where he's from and what life looked like there. But before he could do that, all his brothers got together and built a room on the house where she could stay, because there was no room there for a guest to come. He had a typical Appalachian upbringing in terms of just, immense poverty, poverty of money, not of spirit and love and all those things, abundant love and spirit in that family. But so I'm born into these, two different cultural kind of attitudes about how to be in the world. And that is a big part of my story, moving back and forth between this very Key West, very, boldness about life, and then this sort of Appalachian Presbyterian reserve, both of which are so important to my personality and who I've become, and central to the way I hope that what my values are and the way I hope that I walk in those, or at least aspire to walk in them. So jumping forward, growing up in a small town in Kernersville, my father was a teacher. My mother was a kindergarten teacher, played the piano at church. There wasn't a Presbyterian church in our town, so my father started one. And so we cut the grass, and my father was superintendent of the Sunday school and the teacher of the Sunday school. We vacuumed the floors. We did everything because it was just a small church. We moved from there to Wilkesboro, North Carolina, which is another small town, probably about 5,000 people there. And from there, I went to college and became a teacher myself, and moved to Virginia to get my first job teaching. Taught English in high school, 8th grade, 9th grade, and 12th grade, and figured at that point that I didn't know enough to. I just felt like I didn't know enough. I needed to know more, and went to grad school, and that started this whole kind of second narrative of my life, in terms of, what teaching meant to me, and what my role as a teacher was. It wasn't just about teaching English. It was about teaching students and what that meant. And that's a story we can talk about in a few minutes. But I think that happened while I was in grad school, and learning about what beyond content was the work of the teacher, which is really important. Teaching has taken me to Bulgaria and to Thailand to teach, teaching at the American University of Bulgaria in Blagoevgrad. And this was soon after the Iron Curtain fell there. So it was a very different time to be in Eastern Europe than maybe it is right now. It's in the late 90s. And also in Thailand, working with public and private schools in Thailand, working with the teachers there, helping them work on their skills in English, so that they had more confidence teaching their students. And we were talking about failing earlier, and so the part of my curriculum with those teachers was about how it's okay to fail, and what does that mean, and how does that improve your teaching and free you up as a teacher, to invite students into the conversation, and to invite students into, in this case, to speaking English. And what does failure have to do with that? So we can talk about that later. But yeah, but that's just a little bit.
Great.
Well, and this might be a question for both of you, but if you're teaching English overseas, I'm wondering, do you insert any of the cultural things? I'm assuming you may have to adjust for cultural differences, and how did you navigate that?
So that's a really good question, because for too many decades, English teaching was assumed to be apolitical, and any kind of cultural thing that you threw in was just for interest. You would talk about something supposedly benign, like holidays or American foods or something like that. And the importance of considering how the student's culture relates to your own, and especially to English, has become recognized in, I would say, the last 10, 15 years as extremely important. For example, in context of colonialism, it's just extremely marked. The role that English has cannot be not problematic in a post-colonial country. And more places overseas know that one of the best things a teacher can do is be aware of how problematic the role of English is in the society. And for that reason, a lot of times a native teacher, a teacher native to the area, is actually better qualified than a foreign teacher coming in. Being perfect at the language is not crucial. Having some understanding of how these students relate to the language can be crucial, because if you're not aware of that in any way, the resistance that they experience, which they probably, depending on their age and level of education, aren't completely aware of themselves, the resistance that they're experiencing can overcome any kind of technique or methodology that you're using. That's my experience.
Can you give an example of how a student in another country learning English as a second language
Yeah.
would have a problem with learning that?
Sure. So there's one of my very favorite articles is written by a teacher. He's a famous linguist now. He's been the head of TESOL International, which is the biggest organization worldwide for English teachers of English as a second language. He's an extremely well-known scholar now. At the time, and he's from Sri Lanka originally, and at the time he wrote the article, he had been teaching in Sri Lanka among the Tamil ethnic people, which are the people that he comes from. He is a Tamil, a Sri Lankan Tamil. And he explained how the curriculum that he presented to the students stirred up deep cultural resistance. For example, the curriculum, which was a gift, the books were a gift from an American organization, and it was a series of books that assumed American culture as the norm, and it assumed things that had been asserted in ESL, English as a Second Language pedagogy, over a couple of decades, such as the belief that English should be used in the classroom for actual communication. If the students aren't speaking to each other meaningfully in the classroom using this language, then they can't learn the language. Well, the students understood the value of English were on the international political stage. They understood that English was an official language of their country, and it was used prominently in certain domains, for example, the courts, certain aspects of the government, and of course, when communicating with foreigners, international business, of course they understood it had value. But it was a very deeply held assumption below the level of consciousness with them that was not the language that they used among themselves.
Mhm.
So the methodology, which was assumed in the textbook, called for them to use the language among themselves in all these communicative ways in the classroom. And pretty much any trained teacher at that time would have told you, of course, that's what you do. And to the students, it was, of course, we don't use this language to talk to each other. If somebody did that, the statement would be, I'm not one of you. And there were various other assumptions the textbook made that just clashed with their culture, or if it didn't clash, were completely incomprehensible. But that was one of the core ones.
Very interesting. It makes me think about, this is ugly, America. But it makes me think about how, Americans took the Indians, the American Indians, and said, cut it out, no more of your language. They took that away.
It's been a basic assumption of this country for probably a century that the normal person is monolingual. And when you know a language, you use it for everything. This is not the way the rest of the world works. In most societies, overwhelmingly, people know various languages to varying degrees, and the languages function in different spheres. It's not a problem.
And then here again, it's all pretty America, but you hear people who maybe speak Spanish, in the grocery store. What do people say that are, I like to say, the white supremacists? You need to be speaking English here.
Mhm.
Or better yet, you need to be speaking American. That's my favorite.
Yeah.
So, very interesting. Very interesting. I would never have imagined that, but I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. So how did you get to ETSU, Phyllis?
Yeah, so my partner and I were living in first on two different countries and two different continents, and then we were living in two different states, and then we were living in two different towns in one state. We were trying to we wanted to have the same toothpaste tube. That was our goal. And Johnson City, this area was one of the only places he's from Louisiana. It was one of the only places he was really interested in coming there. The landscape is beautiful here. There are rivers, there's mountains, and he loved this area. And so I applied for, the funny story is I applied for a job at ETSU, and the first time I applied, I didn't get it. And so, so another job came open, so I applied again. They're going to have to tell me no. They're going to have to tell me I'm going to keep knocking on the door, and because I wanted to be here, and David was very interested also in being here, and so at the time I was teaching at Alcorn State in Alcorn, Mississippi, and working with teacher education there, teaching 18th century literature there as well, and loving the work there. But David and I were trying to live in one place, and a position came open here at ETSU that was working with students, working with education, also doing work with women, gender, and sexuality studies, which is also a passion of mine, as well as a kind of academic background. And so when the second job came up, I jumped on it and applied for it.
Now, was this a two academic problem, sort of? Was he in?
No, he's
field, or?
nope. David is a freelance photographer, so
okay.
he is not an academic. There is not an academic bone in his body. He is. We are very different souls. I'm very type A, and he is a free spirit. So. Yeah, and he's on a photo shoot right now, actually. So, yeah. Yeah. So, but I'm very interested in your take, Theresa, on your experience in Sri Lanka and your experience working with folks with English as a second language. Because it's a very different take than my own. When I was in Bulgaria, I mean, what I was thinking about was not their use of English, but was cultural differences that I was seeing. And so all the things that you were just talking about language acquisition, and when you use language and when you don't, and how do you invite that conversation, all of those things are very fascinating to hear. So I'm really glad you shared that. My take was very different. I was very interested in cultural differences and the kind of assumptions that I learned I couldn't make about my students' response to the material or to the assignments, and how coming from the United States, I had an expectation that students would want to sit in a circle with me and have a conversation and, talk about the book and, or sit in my office, and all of us, have coffee and just chat. And that was almost, for them, that was almost an insult. And because their experience was one that was much more formal. And there were all sorts of other types of, cultural things that I had to learn about how to teach within a culture that was not my own, that I really needed to pause and take time to, ask them, what is this experience for you? And plagiarism is an example. A very American idea of plagiarism is citing a source and not telling who citing bell hooks and not putting bell hooks' name at the end in parentheses. But for them, for them, showing that they demonstrate and have mastery of content was using bell hooks ideas, putting them in their own voice, and not citing them because everybody knows bell hooks wrote that.
Mm.
And so for me to come in and say, well, that's plagiarism, like not in their culture,
Mm.
right? And so I had a lot to learn when I arrived on the doorstep in Blagoevgrad in Bulgaria.
And did you find there was any kind of guidance, or were you pretty much,
no guidance, no guidance at all.
How did they let you know? No, we don't do that here.
We don't do that here. We don't, that's not how we do it, because, you know, I invited a student in to talk about what I'm seeing in their writing, and they were quick to tell me, this is what our education system looks like. And no, I invited the conversation. I didn't just say, this is how it's going to be, blah, 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 right? So I invited the conversation, but inviting the conversation, I think, is incredibly important. Not making assumptions about who your students are, not making assumptions about just because you see them that you think you know them, because you see their body, and so that tells you their whole story. It sure does not. And I started learning that in my graduate education, and then I really saw that, you know, when I hit the ground in a place like Blagoevgrad. Yeah, it's amazing all the things your students teach you.
Yeah. So with that, I saw in your bio, your graduate work was at LSU. Was that in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, in Baton Rouge.
So were you in the classrooms during that time?
I was in the classroom at that time. I was working in women, gender, and sexuality studies there, as well as in English. So I was teaching literature courses and composition courses, writing courses, some service learning.
Okay, so this might be a little hard shift, but did you experience any or witness any racism or issues with diversity in Baton Rouge? Because I know it's I'm from New Orleans originally, so
are you
I
really?
know.
Yeah,
It's an
yeah.
interesting area.
Okay, yeah. So it's very, very different area from here. And David's from West Bank.
Oh, me too. What part?
Right on the point. On the point.
Out your point?
Yeah. Okay. That is so great. I didn't know that. I didn't know
What high
that.
school did you go to?
Yeah.
That's the question.
He went to high school in Baton Rouge because
Okay.
they moved around that time.
Okay.
So when he was in school, so he didn't end up going to high school, but he returned there and to work at one of the TV stations there after college. He went to LSU as well. Yeah.
WDSU?
Yeah. So it's very different being in Baton Rouge and New Orleans than it is being in Northeast Tennessee or even Western North Carolina. You were talking, Michelle, you were talking earlier about language and kids in Baton Rouge and Lafayette and Breaux Bridge that spoke French and Occitan were, not allowed to speak French in the school system for a long time. And so that was a situation. My students, when I was at Alcorn, their high school prom the year before, and Alcorn is in Mississippi, not Louisiana, of course, but their high school prom, the Black students had the prom at the Armory and the white students had the prom in the country club. And this was in 2003.
Wow.
The Black students during high school when the harvest came up, would be excused to go work in the fields. This is in 2003. It's 2003.
I think people think those racist events are so long ago.
The last school,
Just look right there.
2016, 2016 in Cleveland, Mississippi is the last school that was integrated.
Right, I think I heard that.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's been in the
2016.
last couple of years. Yeah.
2016. And so these are not issues that are far away and long ago and a part of our history. These are issues that are a part of our culture, a part of our daily lives right now, and part of our students' experience walking into the classroom, knowing that you're the only students that are going to be pulled out to go work in the fields, and everybody's going to think that's okay.
Yeah.
So how does that affirm you as a young mind who is going to be successful and is going to do something great with your life? Well, it starts you off knowing that you have a particular place, and at this time of the year, your place is over here. And so yeah, I had a lot to learn there as well. In terms of what are your experiences, what are your stories, and that was a hard education in some ways. It's a very different experience. It's a very different experience than here, and it's more visible than here. Yeah.
Did you find that the Black kids had a hard time sharing their story with you because you were white, or did they just lay it out there for you?
It was a difference in class. So the freshmen were my first year there. The freshmen were they knew it was their first year, and it was my first year, and I was a white woman, and so I think they kind of took me under their wing to kind of help me navigate. And Alcorn, for folks who don't know, Alcorn is a historically Black college in Mississippi, and so I was the way minority there. I was the token white English teacher coming in, and so that feels really bad a lot of times because of privilege and because of not wanting students, not wanting to misrepresent what I felt like my place was. And so wanting to make sure that I was facilitating and guiding, but not telling them this is the only way to tell a story, or this is the only way to do a thing. But to show them what knowledge in the particular field looks like according to whether we're doing composition, or what are national standards for writing or British literature. What does that look like? I think I got off track though.
No, and then as you move through, how I don't know how many years you were there.
Yeah.
But as you moved through, how did that kind of evolve?
Yeah, so I was only there a couple of years, and because then I got the job here at ETSU. I think as students got to know me, then they began to trust me more, but I was there a lot. I mean, I tried to do a lot of listening. I tried to be present, to demonstrate interest, not just to say that I had interest, but to demonstrate interest. And so I think over time there was more trust, but that was a slower process with the upperclassmen than it was the freshmen. The freshmen were a very different group than it's like the difference between 8th graders and 12th graders, right? The freshmen were a very different group and were much more trusting than the upperclassmen were. Yeah.
That's very interesting. There's almost that element of, as a freshman, I really don't know what to expect either. So we'll all just dive in.
We'll just all dive in, and they were eager to tell their stories. And I don't think anybody had asked them their story before. And so they were eager to show off what they knew, and so that was, and write their stories. And so I think that was good. Where it was, subject matter was different. So when I was working with juniors and seniors, we were working with, they were having to take courses like Introduction to British Literature. Have you seen the Norton Anthology? Which is, a parade of, at that time, it was pretty much a parade of white men. There were very few Black writers and more white women writers, but very few Black writers. And so we did things to mix that up. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has an incredible archive.
That's why I went to graduate school.
Well, then we're gonna have we've got to have a conversation. We have way too many connections. Well, I am so indebted to your graduate school, to your alma mater, because they have this incredible archive of enslaved people's writings and stories. And so, and you can go online. You don't have to travel to Chapel Hill. You can get to that from your seat in the classroom. And so what we did is we put the Norton Anthology down and we read the writings of enslaved people. And then the students decided that they wanted to share what they'd learned. And so they created, Natchez has one of the oldest and one of the largest slave trading markets in the Deep South. And so they worked on the stories that they wanted to tell. We took them to Natchez and presented them for several weeks. The students presented and told these stories of these enslaved folk. And the National Public Radio in Jackson, Mississippi came and recorded them. And so we have a recording of them, and they didn't read their stories. They told those stories. They told those stories too. And people from all over the area came, and these students taught the community what the 18th and early 19th century looked like in the Deep South. And we're real educators for a whole community. It was just powerful. It was just powerful.
Wonder where those kids are now.
I wonder. Some of that, I still know some of their names, and some of them we still corresponded with for a while, and then I've lost touch with others.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah.
So Theresa, tell us, you said you were from Michigan, a little town in Michigan.
Indeed.
So when's the first time you met a Black person? Because I think there are lots, that's Detroit, near that area is
It's
What's
not
it
close to
called?
Detroit. At least it
Okay.
didn't seem like it was anywhere close. Detroit seemed like the other side of the world. Ann Arbor was already pretty far.
You said Ann Arbor, that's right. You're right.
Yeah, that wasn't a place we would go regularly, although we did see the Christmas lights there and stuff. A Black person, there sure weren't any in town.
Did you go to school with any at all as a kid?
Not in the public school, not a single Black person. Now, in 6th grade, I was moved to a private school. Somebody started a private school. It was extremely little. There were 62 kids, and that's all 12 grades. When I went there, then, okay, that was actually probably the first time I went to school with a Black kid. And she was way behind me. I think she was in kindergarten, possibly 1st grade. And actually, if you want to hear that story, I have a rather odd memory about it. To me, it's a rather striking memory about it. My parents were friends with this other couple that my mom went to church with. And we spent a lot of time together. And they had a couple of kids. And their little boy also went to the same school. I think the little girl was not old enough at that time. I think he was in kindergarten or 1st grade. So he was in the same grade as the little Black girl. And one time my mom's friend was over talking to my mom, girl talk, you know, and I was eavesdropping, as was my habit. So this is the conversation I heard. She said that her son had come home from school and he was just chattering about things that had happened in school. It wasn't anything remarkable, just talking about them playing the things he had done at school today. And he happened to mention the name of this little black girl that had been in his game or whatever. And she said her husband said, yeah, playing with her and being her friend, that's all fine. You just don't marry her. And to me, I guess the reason I remember it is that even I was a linguist. And so I was listening to the conversation, and even being very little, it struck me that came out of the blue. But the mom was just laughing about it. And she said to my mom, oh, that's fine with me. Just tell your kids what you think. And my mom was kind of, if I remember right, my mom was kind of quiet about it. My mom is not American, so she doesn't have the same relationship to racism as Americans do. And sometimes she would just sort of stop talking because she didn't know what to say. So I don't know what she thought, but to me, it's like all these years later, I think, wow, it was so important to you to tell this 5-year-old that this kind of person is so different from us that you could not even consider entering into this kind of primary relationship with the person. They have to be kept. There has to be a barrier there.
And it's almost like put that barrier up before you even think about let's be friends. Oh, what did you guys play? It's nice. Barrier.
It was the first thing yeah. The way she reported it, it was the first thing he said. It came out of the blue, unrelated, yeah. But no, there were not very many Black people in that town. That I don't know where that child was driven from. I suspect Ann Arbor or somewhere. Her parents were after a private school and there weren't too many.
Well, that just shows you all the ingrained messages and how young it can start, right?
And not even a question of law. It's just, okay, I'm not supposed to be, I can't marry you. Oh, wow.
That old trope about in the South, it's okay for Black people to be close as long as they're not equal. And in the North, it's okay for them to be equal as long as they're not close. That's completely my impression. That totally holds up with everything that I remember.
I've never heard that before, but
Oh, you haven't?
I have a friend that she used to live in DC, and I would love to go visit her, and we would walk, down DC, and I always thought, why are people staring at us? And I would say, because we're beautiful.
Yeah, definitely.
And she said, it's because we're friends, and you're Black and I'm white. She's white. And so that's completely, it's almost like that's that, northern, southern thing. You can be equal, but you can't be close. You can be close, but you can't be equal. That's the theory. I've never heard that, but that's it, really. Oh gosh, period. That needs to be on flag. Yeah. That's amazing. So do you remember having your first Black friend? So this
Let me think. I would have been in my 20s.
Really?
Oh, yes. It was it was people that I worked with after I had the bachelor's degree, but I hadn't found the job in Korea yet. And I was working in a bank and there were people, and it was in Ann Arbor.
Okay.
So there were different colored people.
Yeah.
And some of them were my friends.
Yeah. Now, when you were in the other countries, did you ever get friend relationships or have close friends of people of other races there?
All the time,
Okay.
yes.
And was that different? Having a Black friend and how that happened versus having a friend of another race or culture someplace else?
I think so. I think I felt the difference more strongly with people in other countries. The lifestyle was very different. Granted, I guess there were cultural differences between me and Black people in Ann Arbor, but shoot, there's cultural differences between me and lots of Americans from lots of different places. And I think the cultural differences overseas were bigger. And that made the friendship have this aspect of, I was always asking questions. How do you do that? And how do you do that?
Yeah.
What do your parents say about that? What do they think about that?
Did you experience racism in other countries? Being white and they.
And I don't think I was ever an object of racism. I definitely saw racism in many different manifestations. Every place, I mean, even in America, the different places have different sorts of racism. Well, just like we were saying, that broad division between North and South, but also finer divisions. In every place I've ever lived in has had its own kind of racism. I mean, Sri Lanka had an ethnic civil war. And that, I mean, to me, that was a striking experience in that it showed me one of the ways that racism can go when it goes very badly.
I'm not a history person, but what was that civil war about within Sri Lanka? Was it ethnic? Was it religion, color?
It was ethnicity, and it's somewhat complicated, and I'm not a historian, so I never grasped it completely. My understanding was there have been both Tamil and Sinhala people in Sri Lanka for a very, very long time, such that they can both claim to have been the first ones there, and nobody really knows. It was like at least 6,000 years ago. And there's also a Malay Muslim group, and I'm not sure how long they've been there, but the country kept getting colonized. They have certain resources that are highly valued. The tea, it's an ideal climate for growing tea. There are all kinds of spices. There are gems in the ground. It's a resource-rich place, so everybody wanted it. It's also kind of strategic militarily, which I don't understand, but everybody wanted it. So it got colonized by Portuguese, colonized by Dutch, colonized by Brits. And the Tamil and the Sinhala people had lived quite peaceably before colonization, as far as I understand. After, when the Brits were there, they wanted to grow tea as a cash crop. They weren't finding good workers on the island because it's a very fertile place. People weren't used to scrabbling for a living, to subsistence farming, and they didn't want to work for slave wages. So what the Brits did was they imported people from a starving part of India. As it happened, the most starving part of India within reach was Tamil Nadu. So a whole different ethnic group of Tamils comes in. Indian Tamils became another ethnic group living there. And of course, the native peoples resented those people working the lands that had been stolen from them. So when the Brits left, there was enmity between Sinhala peoples and these Tamils, and they got lumped in together with the other Tamils, and everything was, of course, left massively destabilized. The land's boundaries weren't clear anymore. So they went to war. That was 1948. It wasn't settled until 2009, and it wasn't settled nicely either. So when we had, people storming the Capitol here, I kept wanting to say to this country, no, you don't want a civil war here. You really don't want a civil war here. You don't understand what you're getting into.
Wow. Amazing. Just amazing. Well, Phyllis, how about you? When's the first time you had a friend of a different race? They can't be Black people.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think probably middle school and high school. In a small town, a lot of what the way your week, the rhythm of your week is around church, is around, Sunday morning church and Sunday afternoon church and Sunday evening church and Wednesday church. And so our church also worshiped, which is the North Wilkesboro Presbyterian Church, also worshiped with the Beulah Church. And so, and at the time it was pretty much a white church and a Black church. And so because our two churches, our youth groups met together, so that was probably during late middle school when I was in youth groups that I was worshiping and was in youth groups in the evenings and with that group of kids as well. And so those were probably my first Black friends that that I knew about their lives and they knew about my life, and we did things together outside of just going to school and being in classes together and seeing each other in the hall and that sort of thing, but actually doing stuff at each other's houses and at each other's churches and that sort of thing.
Did you experience any racism either with them or they? Did you experience seeing them have some racist events?
Yeah, no, I didn't see them having racist events or racist attitudes towards me. They may have, and it went over the top of my head. That's possible, but I did experience it at school because I had Black friends, and I hate to. At school, I was told that I should no longer have those friends, or if I didn't stop having those friends, then something bad would happen to me or happen to them, and it was real bullying and this was when I was in 9th grade.
Told by the other kids or by the grown-ups?
No, by the kids.
Uh-huh.
By the other kids would, circled around me and, and said, we've been watching you and you can't have these friends.
Whoa.
And they were my friends.
Wow. How did you handle that?
I felt really bad for a long time, but they were my friends, and so we stayed friends. And what I saw was that there was I don't know, that some things were dangerous, and there was a lot of stuff that wasn't fair, and people got selected for things based on choices that they made. But and I don't really have words to talk about this really well, so it was hard. It was hard, it was part of my growing up and part of my deciding who I wanted to be and what friendship looked like to me and for me, and that I got to make that decision. But I lost friends over it, and I was excluded from circles and activities because of it. And that was clear. But I saw this, my memory of first grade, my memory of my first day of first grade. I remember 3 things. I remember my black patent leather shoes that my mother put Vaseline all over the night before. I remember holding my mother's hand, and I remember seeing her hand and holding mine. And I remember as we were walking towards going up the steps to the school, I remember a young white boy come running by and assault verbally a young Black boy and called him the N-word right in front of us as I was walking in my first day of school. That is my first memory of school. This is, I think, 1967. There were race riots in Winston-Salem at the time. James Eller was sitting on his front porch in Winston and was a Black man and was killed by white police. And there were riots and kids couldn't. My father was a high school teacher at the time and had to, the buses wouldn't take students, Black students, to or from school. So my father had to drive them, and there were race lines, riot lines. It was a dangerous time.
Was there racial riot?
Race riot in Winston-Salem. And so
someone we had here talked about, I had never heard about that.
yeah, it was in 1967. Yeah, and so this is 7 years after the sit-in, both in Greensboro and in Winston at Crest and in Greensboro at Woolworth.
Yes.
And so this was 7 years after that. So these stories, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, or if we're talking across gender non-conforming LGBT folk and trans folk, Sophie Vasquez, Tom Harden. I mean, these brutal murders that are happening across race and identity. We should have learned by now. This has been going on for a long time, and it's all the more tragic that it continues. And yeah.
And I was born in 1960, and my first day of school was 65, 66. And I do not have any recollection of any, integration problems. I walked right into that first grade class, Miss Connor's class. Not an issue. I've always been a class clown, had a good time. Never, there's nothing in my mind. And my mom is no longer with us. I would love to ask her, did I ever experience anything?
Yeah.
But I don't have any recollection, any bad experience at all. But all that to say, it was just the other day. Like, how long will it take before we learn this lesson?
Yeah.
That people I just want to be me. I just want to be who I am. I want to go to school. I want to be called by this name. I want to dress like this.
Yeah.
What does it take?
And what does that mean for that student, that young Black boy that was called that horrible name? What does that mean for him when he walks into his classroom in terms of him feeling safe enough to learn? In that, I mean, Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book, What Happened to You? I mean, that's all about having a space that's safe enough to learn.
Yes.
Because it's that safety where you build trust and where you can, be creative enough to be vulnerable, to make mistakes or to think big ideas. You cannot have that without safety.
Right.
And I think that's why it's so important that as we work with trauma-informed care, that we bring an equity approach. And so somewhere we were talking about bell hooks earlier. It seems like, to me, at the center of anti-oppressive sort of pedagogies and strategies and trauma-informed care is this education as the practice of freedom. It's the intersection of those two things where there's flourishing and thriving for kids, for students.
And we have probably 0 minutes left, but to throw that in today, you've got this whole crazy story about critical race theory. So in the midst of wanting to teach a child about things that are supportive and that, your culture, your race made lots of contributions to American history. But if we talk about that, you're going to make someone feel sad over here, and that teacher is going to lose their job.
And that teacher did in Sullivan County, and I believe is still not back in the classroom.
No, his and as a plug, he's going to appeal to the Sullivan County School Board. I think it's next Tuesday, I shouldn't say, but their next school board meeting, I think it is Tuesday. So there's a group of folks that are going in to support him. But it goes back to the beginning of my culture is the right way. This is the right way. Was that a pun? But my culture, the white culture, is the only way.
Yeah.
And no matter where we go in the universe, we're going to make it known that this is a language you speak all the time.
Mhm.
If you go into a history class, we're going to make it known that the history that the white supremacists want you to know is the only thing.
Mhm.
That's the only story.
That's the only story.
That's the
There are
only
no other
story.
stories because the other stories will hurt.
Yeah.
And you're not going to make
Yeah.
my little child hurt.
Yeah.
So we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just,
yeah.
frustrating.
And I
And-
think the topic was white privilege, I think around the critical race theory and things like that. And you think how much people think, I think privilege is someone handing them a sack of money on the sidewalk and that's the privilege. But it's like sitting in classroom, not having to think about someone calling you names
Mhm.
before you walk into
Yeah.
the classroom.
Yeah.
Right, like that's a privilege.
Right.
Or
Right.
Or not,
sitting in
and,
a classroom and not
Yeah.
thinking how different or
Right.
Yeah.
other.
and not
you are.
understanding that safety looks different across race or across gender identity
Yes.
or across experience.
And I think there is an incredible lack of people understanding that safety for that transgender student
Yeah.
is completely different from a Black student or a gay student
Yeah.
or a white student. All of those safety, the way that looks
Yeah.
is so completely different.
Mhm.
And if people would just understand that instead of assuming
Yeah.
my safety is the only safety.
Yeah.
Why are you even worried about that? Because
Yeah.
that's not deal. My safety
Yeah.
is what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I have a hard time that people can't see beyond that. Yeah, I have a hard time with that.
It's important to be curious and to ask
Mhm.
questions and to listen.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Speaking of questions, do you guys have questions for each other? You probably answered them in the car ride. over.
We might have. We might have. I mean, one of the questions that we talked about was, how does some of the questions that we're talking about in this conversation relate back to the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, or the work you're doing in the classroom, or the work you're doing at ETSU as ETSU is a culture unto itself, or or any variation on that.
Yeah. One thing that you all have kept reminding me of throughout the night is related to something linguists do, sometimes called discourse analysis, where you just basically examine how people talk about a certain topic. And this has been on my mind a lot lately. When people talk about things like critical race theory being taught in the classroom, or I forget the other example, but the theme is freedom. You keep hearing the word freedom. Well, this is our freedom. We have choices. But when people talk about the basketball players at ETSU taking a knee for the anthem, you don't hear the word freedom. What you hear over and over is respect, respect, respect.
Right.
So that's one thing that I'm real interested in, that a discourse analysis picks up on. As far as in the classroom, I've really appreciated what we've been doing lately with an emphasis on diversity. I find myself slipping that into like student assignments, like, talk about this in your paper, and extra points if you can talk about how that relates to a group that's not normally represented. Just find that handy. How about you?
Yeah. So I think in my classrooms, whether it's a gender-based violence class or a feminist theory class, I think one of the things that we're doing is trying to find ways to take the theory and make it applicable. So how can we apply some of the theories that we're talking about to, whether it's music videos that we're watching, or it's club meetings that we're in, or organizations that we're in. So how do you apply the theory, not just have it as a kind of intellectual exercise, but what is the application for that?
And so what would an example of like a topic or?
Sure. So in the gender-based theory class, gender-based violence class. So we talk about if someone reports a sexual violence to you, then how do you receive that person? What does research tell you how you work with folks who've experienced violence. And so students do really well reading and writing about that research. What's difficult is how to take things that people say. For instance, somebody reports to me they've been sexually violated, and my response is, well, why were you out that late?
Mhm.
Which is blaming response.
Exactly.
So how do you translate that into a response that is compassionate, that's perspective taking, that's empathetic, that is trauma informed? And so what are some, and so working through those kinds of responses to people is harder than one might think. But that practice makes the theory come alive, and it becomes part of their process now, not just something they read in a book and they can quote in a paper, but a way they can receive other people in their lives, in day-to-day lives, and then pass that on. So that would be a quick example.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think I would love to, and again, critical race theory kind of got in the way of this, but I would like to see this evolution from teaching the old way of, in your English classes, using these classic novels that are all white men and white women, and moving towards some that are more diverse authors and more diverse. I heard a fantastic interview on NPR about these incredible African-American classical music composers that, it's either Beethoven, blah, 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 white man. But this is a Black woman who's done this amazing work. And there's a couple of Black guys. It's just this beautiful, beautiful music.
Yeah.
But sorry, tissue. I don't know if they would ever sing those in their choirs.
Yeah.
I don't know if the chamber groups would ever sing those. But it would be so cool if we could make this evolution toward bringing more diverse topics and people and experiences into the classroom, and have that freedom, and not worry that there's going to be a little white kid in the class who's going to say, my feelings are hurt because you played that. So look, I'm going to go home, tell my mom, dad, and then I'll have your job. It just really wears me.
Yeah, I mean, part of education is being able to see yourself mirrored back. I mean, you read the book and you find yourself in the book, and you make a connection, and then you can take that as part of your own experience and do something great with it. Well, if all of the characters in the book are white, then if you are a Black 11-year-old girl, you can't find yourself in that book. You can't find your story in that book. And so if we talk about fairy tales, then why are the fairy tales that only come to our mind, or the Cinderellas and the Snow Whites? What about the Brownie book? Or Tar Baby? Or what about all of the extravagant animal tales, or Virginia Hamilton's work with The People Can Fly? So those are stories that we can also tell that are a whole culture for a whole group of our students that need to know those stories.
Well, and the educators need to be aware of them as well, so they can introduce a more diverse set of authors, stories, and things to students. I just remember having to pick, biography in middle school, and it's like, pick who you want to represent. And I spent 4 years being Martin Luther King, because it was the only or Rosa Parks.
You're so true about that. And there's a learning curve.
You feel like you can't pick someone not of your own race or gender.
And well, you were probably in New Orleans, but I was going to say for a kid here, I mean, we have Septima Clark, who was at the Highlander Center teaching passive resistance and strategies and civil rights education, and right there at the Highlander Center in our own state, right down the road.
Change is going to come.
Yeah.
Well, it is 8:11, folks. This has been great.
It's been great.
Yeah, and we're all teachers.
Yeah. with more connections than we realized. How lovely, how lovely.
So-
Yeah, no wonder we were in over.
That's true too.
The bell's ringing.
I should have started packing up her bag, and then you would have known to stop talking.
Yeah, this has been great. Did we have a problem here? We should.
I did.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So I think we've got our little action plan. McKinney Center is having a non-perishable food drive. It starts, let's see, next Monday? Is
Yes.
that correct? December 12th, I'm sorry, December 13th, and it's gonna go all the way through MLK Day, January 17th. So if you've got any food items, non-perishables, bring them to the McKinney Center.
Yes.
And this will all be brought to the Jonesboro Food Pantry. So that's your action for the next couple of weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And have a fabulous holiday. And thank you guys.
And thank our guests.
Phyllis and
Yes.
Teresa, fabulous.
you. It
We
was a
may have to
pleasure.
have you guys back. This was good.
Round two.
Good. Round 2.
Ding, ding.
All right. Bye, guys.